The first time I saw her, I was standing behind the counter, half asleep and nursing my third cup of watery coffee. It was the kind of night that dragged, quiet, uneventful, filled with the buzzing of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of late-night customers hunting for cold medicine or snacks. She walked in like she had done it 1,000 times before, completely comfortable, perfectly at ease in the space. Her name was Alyssa, and she had the kind of presence that made you look twice, even if you didn't understand why. Not flashy, not loud, just quiet confidence, like she belonged, like she saw things other people didn't. We didn't start as anything, just two coworkers assigned to the same shift. The pharmacy ran on rotating schedules, and the night shift was for those who didn't mind silence, dim lights, and time that moved a little slower. At first, our exchanges were mechanical, shared tasks, passing notes, the occasional gesture when one of us needed backup. But slowly, something shifted, something small. I started noticing the way she moved, efficient, purposeful, with a kind of fluidity that made even the most mundane tasks seem like part of a dance. She had strong hands and long fingers, always methodical, whether she was counting pills, restocking shelves, or flipping through paperwork. I caught myself watching her. It didn't feel strange at first. People watch each other all the time. But this was different. I started noticing details, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was focused, how she always stretched her arms above her head when she got up from a seated position, how her mouth twitched slightly at the corner when she found something amusing. These were the kinds of things you don't normally remember about someone unless you're paying very close attention, and I was. We spent hours together in that place, locked into the rhythm of our shared shifts. There were long stretches of silence, punctuated by the hum of machines and the distant whoosh of the automatic doors. The stillness wrapped around us like a blanket. It made everything sharper. The sound of her breathing when she leaned over the counter, the rustle of her scrubs when she walked past, the faint scent of her skin mixed with the clean, clinical air. Time became fluid in that environment. I would glance at the clock and realize an hour had passed without my noticing. It was like being suspended in a slow-motion film, and she was the only character who felt alive. Sometimes I would stay longer after my shift had technically ended, pretending to finish a report or double-check inventory just to match her pace. She didn't question it. She didn't acknowledge it either, but she didn't seem surprised when I lingered. There was a comfort in that, an unspoken acceptance of presence, a kind of silent agreement that neither of us was in a rush to leave. The chairs in the break room became softer when she was there, the coffee slightly warmer, the vending machine snacks somehow less disappointing. We didn't talk much, but when we did, her voice had a calm, steady cadence that settled into my chest and stayed there long after I went home. There were moments, small, barely there moments, when I felt something stir beneath the surface, like when she brushed past me in the narrow hallway and her shoulder grazed mine, or when she handed me a pen and our fingers touched, just for a second. The contact was innocent, but my skin remembered. It held onto the warmth, amplified it, replayed it. I started catching myself anticipating those touches, leaning ever so slightly toward her when we stood close together, hoping for a brush of skin, a shared breath, something I couldn't name. She had a way of filling a space that made it feel less lonely. The nights didn't seem as long when she was around. The sterile walls of the pharmacy took on a different hue in her presence. I started dressing differently, though I pretended not to notice it myself. I paid more attention to my appearance before leaving for work, chose shirts that fit a little better, tied my hair differently. It wasn't intentional, not at first, but I was aware of myself in a new way, aware of how I looked in the mirror before I left the house, aware of how my reflection might appear through her eyes. It would have been easy to explain it all away. She was kind. She was funny in an understated way. She was someone I respected, someone I admired. It made sense to want to be around her. But the truth ran deeper than that. I felt something around her, something I couldn't ignore, a slow burning curiosity, a hum beneath my skin. The way I noticed her hips when she bent over to retrieve a box, the way her laugh curled into me like smoke, the way I thought about her on my days off, wondering what she was doing, what she was thinking, if she ever thought about me. I started dreaming about her, not every night, just occasionally. Always mundane, always grounded in our shared setting, stocking shelves, sipping tea in the break room, sitting side by side on the loading dock during a fire drill. But in the dreams, there was something else, a weight to her gaze, a slowness to her movements, a closeness that vibrated with tension. I would wake up with the feeling of her hand still resting on mine, phantom-like and lingering, as though sleep had borrowed her presence and forgot to give it back. At work, I tried to stay composed, to act normal, to smile when she looked at me, to keep my eyes from lingering too long. But the awareness was always there, like a soft current running under everything. I was drawn to her, and I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know if it was mutual. I didn't even know what I wanted to happen. I just knew that the idea of her not being there suddenly felt like a kind of loss, like something would go dim. She never crossed a line. Not then. But sometimes I felt like we stood on one together, staring down into the space between us, wondering what might happen if one of us took a step. I wasn't sure who I was in those moments, just that I felt more alive near her. Like the part of me that had been sleeping had started to wake up. And once that part opened its eyes, there was no closing them again. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the way light changes just before dawn. Nothing dramatic, no shift in routine, no spoken acknowledgement, but something beneath the surface had begun to ripple. I felt it in the way my body tensed slightly when she stood close, in the way my breath caught when her voice dropped just a little lower, like it was meant only for me. We were still coworkers, still bound to the structure of our shared responsibilities, but the air between us had taken on a new texture, dense, slow, charged with something unspoken. We had fallen into a rhythm at work. Tasks flowed smoothly, wordless cooperation had replaced the awkward exchanges of early shifts. She always seemed to know what I needed without asking. A fresh roll of labels when mine ran out, a backup count on a tricky inventory item, a look that said, "I've got this, go take a break." That familiarity bred ease, and ease bred something more dangerous, a kind of intimacy that wasn't physical, but felt like it was waiting to be. One night, I was restocking the lower shelves near the vitamins section, crouched with a scanner in one hand and a box of supplements in the other. I didn't hear her walk up behind me until I felt the brush of her leg against my back as she reached over me to grab a clipboard. It was innocent, probably unconscious, just a moment of shared space, but the touch, brief as it was, sent a flush crawling up my neck. My fingers trembled slightly as I placed the last bottle on the shelf. I stayed crouched longer than necessary, pretending to fix a label, trying to gather myself. After that, these moments became more frequent. Her presence always seemed to hover just a little too close, her movements just a little too slow when she passed behind me in narrow spaces. She didn't linger, at least not in any way that could be named, but I felt her attention like sunlight through blinds, filtered yet unmistakably warm. I started anticipating her, waiting for the closeness, for the way her shoulder might brush mine at the register, or her hand might graze mine as we passed reports back and forth. There was a night when we both stayed late, tidying the back room after a delivery had arrived late. The shelves were cluttered, cardboard boxes everywhere, and we worked in tandem, finding places for everything, moving around each other in a quiet dance. She stood on the stepladder, handing me items to stack. Her shirt had written up slightly as she reached overhead, revealing a sliver of skin at her waist. I caught myself staring, Just for a second, but long enough to feel the rush of guilt and something else, something sharper, deeper. When she stepped down and turned, we stood chest to chest for a moment too long. I didn't move, neither did she. Her eyes flicked down to my lips, barely perceptible, but it was there. Then she turned to grab another box, and the moment passed, but not for me. In the break room, we began sitting closer than before. It wasn't intentional, at least not at first. But little by little, the space between us disappeared. Her thigh would press against mine as we scrolled through our phones. Our knees would bump beneath the table. Her elbow would brush mine as she stirred her tea. Each contact sent a pulse of warmth through me, a low hum that settled deep in my core. I stopped pulling away. I let it happen. I even leaned in, just slightly, letting my shoulder rest against hers during the long, drowsy middle of a shift. She never pulled back. I began to feel the weight of her gaze when I wasn't looking. I could be facing the computer screen, entering data, and feel it, the slow, deliberate burn of being seen. I would glance up, and she would be there, eyes steady, unreadable, like she was studying me, not judging, just noticing. I wanted to ask her what she saw. I wanted to know what she thought when she watched me, but I never asked. I was afraid that breaking the silence would shatter the fragile thing that was forming between us. In the quiet hours of those shifts, when the world outside seemed far away, I allowed myself to imagine what it would feel like to reach for her hand instead of the scanner, what it would feel like to let my head rest against her shoulder and stay there, what her skin would feel like under my fingers, warm and soft and real. I imagined the way her breath might hitch if I touched the inside of her wrist, the way her voice might change if I whispered her name in the dark. These thoughts weren't planned. They came uninvited, insistent, relentless. One evening, I stood in front of the refrigerator in the break room, deciding between two sad options, leftover soup or vending machine candy. She came up behind me, her hand reaching past mine to grab a bottle of water. Her arm brushed mine, and I felt her body just inches behind mine. I didn't move. I couldn't. The silence between us was louder than any words. I could feel her breath against my shoulder, feel the tension in my spine building with every second that passed. When she finally stepped back, it was slow, deliberate. She didn't look at me, but the air buzzed between us like static before a storm. I couldn't stop thinking about her after that. She lingered in my thoughts during the drive home, in the shower, in bed. I started craving our shifts together. Not just because they were easier, smoother, but because of her. Her presence had become something I needed, something that filled a space I hadn't known was empty. I began to count the days between our shifts, marking them like someone waiting for the next chapter in a book they couldn't put down. I didn't know what she felt. Maybe nothing. Maybe it was all in my head. But there were too many moments, too many almosts, too many silences filled with things neither of us dared to say. We existed on the edge of something, both aware, both afraid to name it. Every shift felt like a held breath, like waiting for lightning to strike. I didn't know if we were brave enough to step across that invisible line. But I knew this: if she ever reached for me, really reached, I wouldn't pull away. I was already halfway to her, waiting. It was a Friday night, the kind that felt suspended in amber, slow and quiet, with just the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional beep from the register breaking the silence. The parking lot outside was nearly empty, painted in orange under the glow of flickering lamps. Inside, everything felt still, like the building itself was holding its breath. We were alone, the last two on shift, finishing up the closing duties in sync, barely speaking, but completely in rhythm. There was nothing unusual about the night, at least on the surface. But underneath it all, something felt different. Something was waiting. I was organizing the drawer beneath the counter, crouched down and sorting receipts, when I heard her footsteps approach. They were slow, measured, and when she stopped behind me, the air around us seemed to shift. I stood up slowly, turning, and found her closer than I expected. Too close. Her eyes met mine, and there was something in them. Steady, unreadable, but undeniably charged. Neither of us said anything. There was no need. The space between us felt like it had disappeared, like we had already crossed into something new without realizing it. She reached past me to place a stack of receipts on the counter, and her arm brushed my side. It was a simple movement, but my body reacted instantly. A flutter low in my stomach, a prickling awareness that crawled over my skin and settled there. I stayed still, letting the moment stretch, letting the silence speak. When she didn't move away, I turned slightly, our shoulders now touching, the warmth of her seeping into me. I looked at her, and she looked back, eyes soft but unflinching. I felt a question in that gaze, not spoken, but asked all the same. My heart thudded once, hard and clear, and then I leaned in. The first touch of her lips was tentative, searching, like she wasn't sure if this was real. I responded without hesitation, letting everything I'd held back rise to the surface. The kiss deepened, slowly, like a tide coming in. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer, anchoring her to me. Her fingers slid up my arms, curling around my shoulders. Our bodies pressed together, fitting like we had done this 100 times before in another life. I could feel her breath catch, feel the way she tilted her head just so, inviting more. The world outside vanished. There was only this, her mouth warm and soft against mine, the trembling in her fingers, the heat that spread through me like wildfire. I kissed her harder, needier, and she responded in kind, her hand sliding into my hair, gripping gently. We broke apart only for breath, our foreheads touching, our lips barely a breath apart. Her chest rose and fell against mine, matching rhythm. I could taste her, feel her heartbeat through our clothes, feel her hesitation melt into urgency. She took my hand and pulled me toward the back room, past the shelves, past the cleaning supplies, into the small office we rarely used. It was dim, the only light coming from the hallway. The door clicked shut behind us, sealing us off from everything else. She turned to face me, and I stepped into her, wrapping my arms around her, our mouths meeting again, this time faster, hungrier. Her hand slid under my shirt, fingertips trailing over bare skin, setting off a cascade of sensation that made my knees weak. I pulled her closer, feeling her hips press against mine, feeling the undeniable truth of what we both wanted. Clothes came off slowly, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Her hands were warm, curious, reverent. She peeled my shirt over my head and traced her fingers down my sides, watching my reactions with eyes that burned. I tugged at the hem of her scrub top, lifting it, revealing the smooth skin beneath. Her bra came next, and I paused, breathless at the sight of her, at the intimacy of being allowed to see her like this. She reached for me, and I pressed into her, our bare chests meeting, skin to skin. I gasped at the contact, at the overwhelming closeness, at the way her body fit so perfectly against mine. We moved together to the small couch in the corner, barely wide enough for one, but suddenly the only place in the world I wanted to be. She straddled my lap, her thighs warm against mine, her mouth never leaving mine for long. Her kisses grew deeper, messier. Her hands roamed my body like she was memorizing me. I slid my fingers down her spine, marveling at the curve of her back, the way she shivered beneath my touch. I kissed her neck, her collarbone, the swell of her breast, and she moaned softly, a sound that filled the room and wrapped around me like silk. Her hips rocked against mine, slowly at first, then with more pressure, more urgency. I arched up into her, feeling every inch of her, every subtle movement. I let my hands explore her freely now, her back, her waist, the sides of her thighs, her ass, every soft curve that I had only imagined before. She ground into me, chasing something, and I gave it to her gladly, losing myself in the rhythm we created. Eventually, she shifted, lying back against the cushions, pulling me over her. I kissed her all over, her chest, her stomach, her hips, until she was trembling beneath me. My fingers slid between her thighs, finding her warm and ready, and when I touched her, really touched her, her breath caught in her throat. She clutched at my arm, grounding herself as I moved gently, deliberately, learning her. Her hips lifted to meet my hand, her body arching, her legs wrapping around me. I watched her unravel, watched her lose herself, watched her come undone beneath me. And when she did, she said my name, softly, like a prayer. Afterward, we lay together in silence, tangled in each other, our bodies slick with sweat and breathing still uneven. I felt the thrum of her heart against mine, felt the rise and fall of her chest, the slight twitch of her fingers on my back. The room was quiet except for us, and in that quiet, something settled. We had crossed a line, one we both knew could never be uncrossed. But I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel fear. I felt something warm and rooted, something undeniable. I felt her arms around me, holding me close, and I held her back. The shift after everything changed felt different from the moment I walked through the door. The lights were just as harsh, the shelves just as neat, the register just as temperamental, but the space held a new weight now, like it had absorbed something sacred. The floor where we'd passed each other countless times, the break room with its cracked linoleum table, even the dull hum of the cooler in the back, they all pulsed with the memory of what we had done. The air felt thicker, warmer, and I found myself standing still for a beat too long, just to catch my breath. She was already there when I arrived, standing by the counter with her hair pulled back, going through the end-of-day logs. Her movements were the same, the calm certainty in the way she wrote, the arch of her back as she leaned forward, the way her thumb traced the edge of the clipboard absently. But now, everything meant more. Everything echoed with what I had felt when her skin was against mine, when her mouth was on my neck, when she moaned into my ear like she was giving me a piece of her no one else had ever seen. That memory sat just beneath my skin, vibrating softly, threatening to rise at the slightest touch. When she looked up and met my eyes, there was no smile, no blush, no shift in posture to betray anything. But there didn't need to be. Her gaze was steady, charged, quiet in its knowing. It didn't ask for confirmation. It simply acknowledged what we now shared. And just like that, the silence between us became a language again, a slow, unhurried rhythm that said, I remember. I still feel it too. We moved through the motions of the night like we always did, scanning items, sorting deliveries, cleaning shelves. But our proximity felt electric. I was aware of her in a way I had never been before. The heat of her body when she stood near, the scent of her skin when she passed behind me, the faint indentation of her lips when she bit them in thought. Every detail now had history. Every movement had memory. We didn't touch, not outright, but every time our arms brushed, every time our fingers almost met on a clipboard or receipt, it felt like a spark leapt between us. Not explosive, not urgent, just warm, persistent, alive. There were moments when we lingered, when one of us took a second too long to pass by, when the space between our bodies thinned to the edge of contact. I found myself looking at her mouth when she spoke, not hearing the words, just watching the shape of them. I caught her watching me as I stopped shelves, her gaze trailing from my shoulders to my waist, her lips slightly parted, like she was remembering how I had felt beneath her hands. We shared coffee during our break, same table, same chairs. But when she handed me the mug, her fingers brushed mine and didn't move away. My stomach tightened. I held the contact just a second longer than necessary, enough to let her know I noticed, enough to feel her warmth spread up my arm and settle somewhere deep in my chest. We sat in silence, sipping slowly, the fluorescent light overhead casting soft shadows on the table between us. I kept glancing at her hands, remembering how they moved across my body, how they held me when I trembled, how they anchored me when everything else dissolved. Later, I stood at the sink in the break room washing out mugs. She came up behind me, not touching, not speaking, but close enough that I could feel her breath near my neck. My skin prickled. I didn't move. I waited. She didn't do anything. No bold move, no second act, just stood there. And that was enough. That quiet presence, that trust in the silence, felt more intimate than anything else that shift. Our dynamic didn't change outwardly. No one around us would have known. We still clocked in and out like always, still joked under our breath when the printer jammed or a customer got difficult. But beneath the surface, we were completely different. Every shared glance was laced with memory. Every routine motion now held something beneath it, something unsaid but deeply understood. There was a moment near the end of the shift. We were restocking bandages in the far aisle, the store almost entirely empty. She bent to grab a box from the bottom shelf and looked up at me through her lashes. I reached to hand her another box, and our hands touched. She didn't let go right away. Her thumb traced a slow, deliberate circle against the back of my hand. My pulse stuttered. I didn't pull away. We stood like that for just a breath longer than the moment required, and then the box passed between us, and we kept working like nothing had happened. But my skin tingled for the rest of the night. Even mundane tasks had transformed. The cart we always used now reminded me of the way she had lifted me onto the couch in the back room. The supply closet echoed with the sound of our breathing, rapid and desperate, muffled by kisses. The office, with its dusty window and crooked blinds, still held the scent of our skin, faint but inescapable. Every corner of the building held a piece of that night, etched into the walls, into the silence, into the rhythm of our footsteps. When the shift ended, we didn't linger. We didn't speak. I grabbed my bag, she grabbed her keys. But as we passed through the sliding doors into the cool air of early morning, she brushed her fingers against mine, just once, light, fleeting, but filled with intention. I looked over, and she didn't smile. She just looked at me with that same quiet certainty, like she knew something that didn't need to be said out loud, and I nodded, barely perceptible, but enough. Driving home, I felt her in the seat beside me, even though she wasn't there. I heard the echo of her laughter in the hum of the engine, saw the outline of her profile in the streetlights flashing across my windshield. My body still hummed with the memory of her touch. My heart still beat in time with hers. We hadn't made any promises. We hadn't said what came next. But that night, in every brush of skin, in every shared glance, we had written something into the space between us. Something quiet, something permanent, something real. It didn't fall apart all at once. It was more like a quiet unraveling, a slow, creeping shift that settled into the spaces where everything used to feel safe. We were still sharing shifts, still moving in sync, still exchanging those glances and touches that lived in the hush between words. But something had shifted. There was hesitation now, a new kind of silence, not the warm kind we used to lean into, but something colder, more cautious. I could feel it in the way she avoided my eyes when we passed each other in the hallway, in the way her hand would flinch just slightly before pulling away too fast after brushing mine. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just stress, fatigue, a rough night, a hard week, but that didn't explain the tension I felt growing between us, like smoke, too thin to grasp, too thick to ignore. The closeness that once felt so effortless now required effort. I found myself overthinking everything. Should I stand this close? Should I say that? Should I reach for her hand like I used to, or would she recoil? I started pausing before speaking. I started listening for things in her tone that maybe weren't there. Every glance she didn't return felt heavier than the ones she did. There was a moment during a stockroom cleanup when we both reached for the same box and our fingers touched. Normally, we would have shared a soft look, maybe even smiled. This time, she pulled her hand back quickly and turned away. She didn't say anything, just grabbed a clipboard and started writing. I stood there with my palms still tingling and a hollowness opening up inside my chest. It felt like rejection, but worse, because it wasn't harsh. It was soft, quiet, uncertain, and uncertainty was harder to fight. I didn't know what I had done, or maybe it wasn't something I did. Maybe it was everything we hadn't said. We had shared so much without words, but now the absence of them felt dangerous. There was no map for what we were trying to be. We hadn't talked about it, hadn't set any rules, any boundaries. We had just fallen into each other, breathless, aching, real. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe it was too much. Or maybe it wasn't enough. The more I tried to close the space between us, the more I felt her retreating. Not in a dramatic way, not in anger or coldness, but with a kind of carefulness, like she was putting cushions between us, soft barriers that didn't wound but still kept me out. Her kindness didn't disappear. She still made my coffee the way I liked it, still left notes reminding me to eat, still covered my register when I needed a minute. But now, all of it felt mechanical, like she was doing it because she was supposed to, not because she wanted to. And then came the jealousy. Quiet and sharp and unwanted. The way she laughed too long at a customer's joke. The way she seemed lighter, freer when talking to someone else. I watched her from across the floor and felt something twist in my stomach. I hated it. I hated that I was becoming possessive of something we hadn't even defined. But I couldn't help it. I had touched her, tasted her, held her body against mine like a secret. And now she felt like a stranger again, one I desperately wanted to reach but couldn't. Nights were the hardest. When I lay in bed and replayed every moment of our shifts, searching for signs, dissecting her expressions, her gestures, wondering if she regretted what we'd done, if she was ashamed, if she had only wanted the heat of the moment and now wished it could be undone. I tortured myself with possibilities, imagined every reason she might be pulling away, and still I didn't ask. I didn't force the conversation. I didn't demand clarity. I just waited, hoping she would offer something, anything. There was one shift where we ended up alone in the break room, both of us sitting with our own silences. She sat with her legs pulled up, scrolling through her phone. I sat with my hands clenched around a mug that had long gone cold. The room was filled with everything we didn't say. I wanted to reach out and touch her knee, to remind her that I was still here, that nothing had changed for me. But I didn't. I stayed frozen, the distance between us suddenly feeling too wide, too sacred to cross without an invitation. We worked beside each other that night like strangers who knew too much. She didn't look at me the way she used to, or maybe I just couldn't see it anymore through the fog of my own doubt. I found myself retreating too, pulling back in tiny ways, answering less, smiling less, matching her distance. We became two people orbiting something broken and unnamed, afraid to get too close in case it all shattered. I missed her. And not just the touch, the kiss, the press of her body. I missed her laughter, her quiet presence, the way she used to lean into me at the end of a long shift and sigh like I was the only thing in the world she needed. I missed the way my heart used to lift when I saw her name on the schedule next to mine. Now it only clenched. Still, there were glimmers, moments when her eyes would meet mine and soften, when her hand would linger for just a second longer than it should, when she would brush past me and hesitate like she was trying to decide whether to say something, and then she wouldn't. She never did. I lived in that limbo, waiting for her to choose, wondering if she already had. I didn't know how to ask for more without risking losing what little we still had. So I stayed quiet. I let the distance grow, and every shift, every hallway pass, every shared task became a reminder that we were standing on a boundary neither of us knew how to cross anymore. A boundary we had already stepped over once, and now didn't know how to return from or move beyond. It didn't happen in a moment of revelation. There was no dramatic confrontation, no heated conversation or tearful admission. What shifted between us came gently, like sunlight creeping through a curtain, slow and warm and impossible to ignore. One morning, after another long night of quiet work and shared avoidance, I realized the ache in my chest had dulled, not disappeared, but softened. Not from forgetting, but from understanding. We weren't what we had been, but we weren't gone either. She was still there, still moving through the pharmacy like she always had, still doing her job with quiet efficiency, her hands precise, her attention sharp. But she had started looking at me again. Not constantly, not obviously, but long enough that I noticed. Long enough that the pulse in my neck quickened whenever her gaze lingered. There was a new kind of awareness between us now, one shaped by restraint, defined by all the things we had felt and done and left unsaid. We didn't try to define it, maybe because we both feared what naming it might mean, maybe because we knew too much had passed for us to go back, and we weren't quite ready to go forward. So we settled into the in-between, into a rhythm where intimacy existed not in touches or declarations, but in small, intentional acts. She would hand me a pen, and her fingers would graze mine just slightly, just long enough to remind me of her skin against mine. I would brew a second cup of coffee and leave it at her workstation without a word. Our connection had retreated from the physical, but it had not vanished. It had simply gone quiet, thoughtful, patient. Sometimes I caught her watching me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, her eyes soft, almost wistful, as if she was remembering the shape of my body beneath her hands, the sound of my breath in her ear. And I would look away, not because I didn't want her to see me, but because I wasn't sure how to hold that kind of gaze without falling into it. We had learned each other's bodies in stolen hours, in half-lit rooms, but now we were learning something else. The space that love occupies when it has no name, the way connection survives when everything else falls into silence. She started staying after her shift again, not every night, not with any clear purpose. Sometimes she would linger, organizing receipts that didn't need organizing, restocking shelves that were already full. I never asked why. I just stayed too. We'd move around each other in comfortable silence, finding excuses to be close, to be in each other's air. One night, she stood behind me as I counted inventory, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath on my neck. She didn't touch me. I didn't turn around, but I felt her presence settle against my back, like a question she didn't need to ask. I didn't need to answer. At home, I carried her with me in small ways. I would lie awake, remembering the sound of her laughter echoing in the stockroom, the way she used to press her lips to my shoulder in the dark. I'd think about the way her hands knew exactly where to touch, not just to bring pleasure, but to soothe, to calm, to say stay without ever speaking. My body still remembered her, still wanted her, but now the wanting came with a quiet reverence, a respect for the space we had chosen to hold between us, for the patience it took to let something breathe. I stopped resenting the silence. I began to hear the truths it held, the steadiness of her presence, the way she showed up every shift, never cold, never cruel, just quiet, constant. She hadn't left. She hadn't forgotten. She was still here, beside me, holding her part of this fragile connection with a kind of care that I hadn't noticed before. And maybe that was love too. Not the kind that explodes and consumes, but the kind that stays, that waits. There were moments when I wanted to break the silence, to reach across the space and ask what we were, where we were going, if she felt the same ache I did when our fingers almost touched but didn't. But I held myself back, not out of fear, but out of trust. Trust that if she wanted to speak, she would. Trust that this thing between us wasn't over, just changing shape. And in those quiet nights, as we walked side by side through the fluorescent glow of the pharmacy, I began to understand that love doesn't always need to be spoken aloud to be real. Sometimes it lives in the glances we don't mean to give, the pauses in a sentence, the breath held between two heartbeats. It lives in the care taken not to hurt, in the choice to stay close, even in the silence, especially in the silence. I no longer needed her to say anything. I could see it in the way her eyes softened when they met mine, in the way her shoulder brushed mine as we stood behind the counter, in the way she waited when I locked up, even when she could have left already. I could feel it in the way her fingers lingered on the doorframe when she passed through, in the way she existed beside me, not demanding, not explaining, just there. Whatever we were now, we were still something, not what we had been, not yet what we might become, but something that held value, something worth staying for. And in that quiet space between the past and the possible, I found peace. She wasn't a chapter that had ended. She was a sentence still being written, and I was willing to read it slowly, one word at a time, trusting that it would take us somewhere neither of us could yet name, somewhere tender, somewhere true.